Okay, thank you everybody for being with us today. We are happy to welcome Professor Erika Denise Edwards to our series on race and ethnicity. A few words about Professor Edwards. She is an associate professor of Latin American history at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Erika's research focuses on Black experience in Argentina. She has recently published Hiding in Plain Sight, Black Women, the Law, and the Making of a White Argentine Republic, which is a gendered analysis of Black erasure in Argentina. The book has won the Association of Black Women Historians 2020 Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Prize and named one of the best Black perspectives Black history book in 2020. Professor Edwards' research advocates for a relearning of Argentina's Black past and the origins of anti-Blackness. She has been quoted and consulted by the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, and La Voz del Interior. So welcome, Professor Edwards. Your talk today is about this book. So again, Hiding in Plain Sight, Black Women, the Law, and the Making of a White Argentine Republic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks. So first and foremost, I want to thank you, Dr. Morania, for this opportunity to present my book and the Latin American Studies program, as well, of course, as the university, Washington University in St. Louis. Before I get started, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And ultimately, I want to begin with a bit of a story. I first was introduced to and visited Argentina in 2002 while I was studying abroad. And so I always advocate for that for anyone. Please take that opportunity. And it was probably about the third week there that I noticed that no one looked like me. And I was quite shocked and surprised. I knew nothing of Argentina, but I had learned that slavery had existed throughout the Americas. So I was expecting to see some level of mixture, possibly someone who looked like me that would represent this enslaved past. And I didn't find anyone. It took, again, until about 3.5 weeks for me to actually see another Black person. And I ran up to them and I said, me, you, me, you. That's about the level of my Spanish. And we became ultimately good friends. She was from Brazil. But it struck me about that occurrence. And as I stayed there longer, roughly for about 6 months, I really started to question, well, what happened to the Black population? I went back to school, decided to pursue this in grad school, shifted a little bit and decided to look at more legal frameworks and understandings of legal identities until this happened. 2014 comes forward. I'm already working on another book. And I notice right away the blogs are just lighting up. And the question is, how is it possible that this World Cup team from South America does not have one Black player? In fact, they found it ironic that Germany had a Black player. So where was Argentina's Black players? And so the next thing I know, I see all these blogs trying to explain what happened to them. And I kept thinking, well, this is strange because those of us that do Black history in Argentina and in the United States, we know already what happened. It was already discussed. So it just shocked me that the blogs and everyone was coming forth with these reasons or these myths to explain the disappearance. And so at that moment, then I decided, okay, I'm going to provide a book about this. And so I ultimately started from scratch again. I decided, this clearly needs to be discussed, and rarely do we find at times something that took place in the colonial period can help answer a present day question. So when I started to do that, I quickly discovered this article, Argentina, Land of Vanishing Blacks, which was published by Ebony Magazine in the 1970s. And so clearly, like I mentioned, there had already been a discussion of what had happened to the Black population. And she ultimately interviews this family, which is featured actually on the cover of, or the cover of the article, excuse me, first page, in which this is the Montes sisters. And you have one that is clearly phenotypically dark, and then one that's middle, and then one that's very, very light. And I thought that was very telling of this process of, as she would argue, was the vanishing process. And so I was struck by that. And then I continued to do more work and discovered, of course, Argentine scholars had been doing the work since the 1960s. But it wasn't until Reed Andrews's book in 1980 came forward that really took on that riddle and ultimately corrected all of these myths, all these ideas that they died in the wars of independence, or that they were killed off because of yellow fever, or my favorite, which I heard myself, was they didn't like it in Argentina, so they all moved to Uruguay because there's still some there, to miscegenation. Well, he took to task all of those and ultimately came forth with the reason of this Black disappearance. And it comes forward at the end of the 19th century. He argues with this shift in ideology, this push for modernization, this notion of civilization, which meant European immigration, which whitened the Black population, both physically because of the amount of immigrants that came over and ideologically. So I said, I don't want to repeat that, but clearly something that happened, almost 40 years ago at this point, still has not reached the broader audience. And so I decided I'm going to look at this, but I'm going to look at it at a different angle. And what I ultimately decided to do is, there we go, is to go to Cordoba. And I decided to go to the interior of the country because I knew that first and foremost, most history about Argentina still centers Buenos Aires. So unfortunately, the Buenos Aires experience has become the national experience. And I knew that, especially when dealing with Black disappearance and Blackness in general, socioeconomic environments make a difference. And so I went to the interior, to Cordoba, in order to provide at least a juxtaposition to the Buenos Aires narrative. I also went to Cordoba because it is a very colonial city. And one of the things that is so amazing and beautiful about the city even today is that you can still walk when you go to the historic downtown, you can still sit in the original plaza and see, for example, the cathedral and the cabildo. And it's during this rich colonial history, then I said, I want to focus on how then at the end of the 18th century, where we have a visible Black population, do we get to the end of the 19th century where people are now arguing if you want to see a Black person, you have to go to Brazil? Well, prior to that end of Blancamiento, what is the process before that? And so what I'm showing you here with Cordoba is actually its original city map. This was drawn in the 16th century. And as I mentioned, today you can still go to the plaza, which clearly is a lot bigger, but you could still go to this plaza, and the cathedral is still ultimately in the same location, as well as the cabildo. So this really stresses, especially for this particular area of downtown Cordoba, how it has been able to maintain itself for so long. And in fact, this colonial city remained the same size roughly for 300 plus years. And so that really helped me to look at this transformation and see this blackness to whiteness or blackness to otherness because it remained such a small city. In fact, in 1778, with the first census that took place, it was roughly about 7,000 people. And then towards the end of my study, 1840, it had only risen to 13,000. So this all came together to create this perfect storm, in a sense, to study then how and what happened to and why the Black population so-called disappeared. But in order to also add another juxtaposition to previous studies about disappearance, I decided to focus on her. And I chose her because most of the studies about Blacks in Argentina privilege the Black male experience. Usually it's because of the wars of independence with the bicentennial that came forth. We saw this explosion, but I noticed, well, what about her? She's there. But as my book title suggests, she was always hiding in plain sight. So once I decided to focus on her, I had to privilege where she was living, loving, and laboring, and that was the household. So that then became the central point of focus, excuse me. And I recognized the political space that it ultimately had. So by looking at the household, I'm ultimately looking at larger societal constructions of racial identity as well as gender. And what I decided to do is then to look at specific roles: concubines, wives, mothers, and daughters. So first were concubines. And what I found was this amazing court case that dealt with this woman named Bernabella Vichamante. And Bernabella started out as a slave, but quickly became a lover to a vicar, so a high-ranking Catholic priest. And this love affair caused such a scandal because they didn't try to hide it. Instead, they were quite public with their emotions. So much so that they often argued that she was a problem because of how she dressed. In fact, she was breaking the law, sumptuary law. She was wearing gold, she was wearing silk, and what made it even more egregious is that he supported her transformation. Another thing that was also very clear about this movement towards whiteness was that oftentimes they cited that she was the color of a Spanish woman. So that meant that as senoras would come forward in the court case, they were very jealous of her and wanted to protect their privilege. And so she was a threat. And he was even a bigger threat because he allowed it to happen. But why would she do this? And this is ultimately the central argument of my book. What I found for each of these women was that they looked to escape their Blackness in order to find levels of social mobility. In other words, with the choices that they had, they decided in order to create a better life for herself, Bernabella, and her daughter, in this case, she was going to have to find a way to become a senora or a Spanish woman. This act worked until they were finally caught. And it took about 10 years. I mean, they were going back and forth. She was banished, and then they'd run away, and then the military would have to come and get the militia, would have to come and get them. They were so upset, these slaves themselves that had started, they were all slaves together, and now they were being told that they have to call her senora. Finally, the church had enough and eventually will excommunicate him. I'm still working through this court case because it's so brilliant and fascinating, but it was so telling as well as what and how some, and I stress some, women of African descent could climb the social ladder with the assistance of their lovers. But again, this was a precarious situation, and it would take a legal bond in order to really ensure that she could leave behind her Blackness. And that's where I found in my another chapter the importance of marriage. And by looking at marriage, what I found overall during the 18th century, the church did allow for enslaved women and white men, usually foreign, to marry. In fact, there was roughly about 25. Of these 25 marriages that took place, 6 of these women over time became doñas. So again, you see the protection that is afforded by having oftentimes a powerful a powerful partner or a husband, but then the legal aspect meant that unlike a concubine, she can maintain levels of the social mobility and of course have the inheritance and assist and protect her children. This, however, was too much, clearly, throughout all of Spanish America. And so we find this law known as the Royal Pragmatic that comes forth that attempts to curb these unequal marriages. But still, the law allowed for couples that truly were in love and had just cause to marry to go against, in this case, their parents who were prohibiting it. In order to do so, they had to ultimately prove their love was just in these court cases, they're known as marriage dissent cases. And so what I did was I gathered all the verdicts of these cases in which these women were accused of having mala sangre, which ultimately means that they were Black. And what I found, when I just looked at the verdicts of these couples that wanted to marry, is those that claimed that there was a mistaken identity, and in fact that they were actually Spanish or Indian, were allowed to eventually marry. Those who instead claimed and maintained their African descendant identity, but attempted to argue along the lines of honor and virtue, were denied. So this was also another avenue of looking at how racial identity is so fluid and the ways in which Argentina became more of a white nation. So similar to Bernabella, there were of course cases in which I saw these women were proclaiming to be Spanish. But what really shocked me was when I found cases such as Manuela Arrieta, who claimed instead that they were actually Indian. And that really shifted my understanding then of the whitening process. And ultimately, this is why I argue that whiteness is more about privileges than the actual notion of being a white person. And that really helped me to see where this Black and brown divide also oftentimes in the historiography has prohibited us from oftentimes seeing that they were constantly interacting as well. So in her case, she used the law, which ultimately said that noble Indians were distinguished Spaniards, and thus they too could marry because they were equivalent to Spaniards. She used it to proclaim and through witness accounts that she was a descendant of noble Indians. In fact, she argued that, you know, her grandfather, I believe, was a cacique, and she was allowed to eventually marry. So again, this browning process of this brownness and kind of through a different view of what it meant to ultimately escape Blackness. This browning process and the claims of indigenous identity continued even through the Republican period. And I want to stress that this is where and why I'm so happy I went to the interior. In going to the interior, then I saw more of a conservative culture and one that ultimately maintained a lot of its colonial practices and legacies well throughout the 19th century. And in this case, what we see is how mothers played an integral role in the freeing process. Again, thinking about the fact that Cordoba is conservative, what we find is, unlike Buenos Aires, where we have the free womb law coming forward, and it's also implemented in Cordoba, but in Buenos Aires, there are these cases that are fighting to show that they should be freed. I don't have those cases in Cordoba. Yes, that is enacted, but instead, these contested freedoms often pointed to an issue of, again, mistaken identity, in which they used a very old law from the 16th century that declared that Indians were free legally. Socially, of course, they still suffered, but legally they were free. And that is what my court cases showed in the 19th century. That is what Maria Guerra used in order to become free. Her employer, as she would argue, had died, but his children were attempting to sell her. And so she came forward and said, that's impossible because I'm from the Pampas. In fact, I can show this genealogy that I am Indian, that my great grandmother came over to serve this family, and we've been serving this family for generations, that we wear certain clothes such as mantas, that my sister is married to a cacique who lives in La Toma, which was an annexed Indian pueblo. And so I have these connections to show that I am actually Indian. I am not a slave. Now they countered with, well, you have a nickname of La Conga, so you must be from Africa, thus enslaved, but she actually won. And what makes it even more fascinating is this freedom is traced through, inherited through the maternal line. And so that meant that when she became free, her children became free, and her grandchildren became free. So 3 generations of freedom, because she successfully proved that she was indigenous. Again, looking at these levels of privilege that she sought. In her case, it was to evade any type of enslavement and instead become free. And in doing so, what she did was she went from becoming a potential slave to a free Indian. I found other cases as late as the 1830s also showing this as well. And in this case, he was arguing that he was brought from the Pampas with his mother, and they had served in a similar capacity, and thus he also was seeking his freedom because there's been a mistake, so to speak. So looking at this transformation from blackness to brownness also adds a layer of understanding this whitening process. And again, I think this is what makes it, and I'm very happy what makes this a unique find is going to the interior and then also seeing how these socioeconomic and political environments shape our understanding of racial identity. Lastly, our daughters in the household and how they served the larger Republican project. In 1782, there was a girls' school that was created that ultimately was used to rescue orphaned girls from the streets and to help them learn how to be good señoras. They catered ultimately to Spanish girls, but they did allow between 6 to 8 mulatas to enter the school and help serve them and also receive a similar education. But in the 19th century, things were changing. And what we know is because of the Free Womb Act, there is a growing free population throughout Cordoba. And this free population, at least according to governing and ecclesiastical authorities, weren't quite ready to experience what is freedom. So instead, there was a sense that they had to uplift them from their moral ignorant ways and teach them how to be good citizens. But knowing that they would ultimately not legally be citizens, but at least help to raise future citizens, which are sons. So I want to make that clear, because men can legally become citizens, women could not, but they still served a role. And so what makes this very interesting is that in Cordoba, it wasn't just going to be Spanish girls. It was going to be all girls that needed this training, that needed to ultimately go to school. And in the case of Bernardina, her manumission, her freedom was tied to her going to school. So as long as she finished school, she would be free. And that again shows us how, freedom ultimately was not, those that are African descent that were now free, and in this case, being born free, just were not ready to participate as full members. And so we have then this brilliant manumission that takes place, and she joins the school, which opens its doors to a free Parda class in 1811. This class, however, is segregated. And for these free Pardas, such as Bernardina, they had to commute. So they were not allowed to stay on the grounds like the Spanish girls were. They also received rudimentary education and were geared more towards domestic chores. And that to me is clearly showing where they would be in the Republic. So for those that were Spanish, as you can see, there's a piano in the background. They would learn that. They would learn how to arrange flowers. They would learn some levels of math, for example. Another picture, as you see, is the bed. This is from the museum that exists today. That's where they slept, for example. But as you can see in the corner, oftentimes Pardas would be regulated to that area to learn domestic skills. These Pardas, though, was also very encompassing, because not only did they represent Afro-descended girls, but it represented formerly labeled castas and Indian girls. So this coming together to create almost an othering process is also very telling about the now institutionalized whitening process. And it was via these schools via this school that it was happening. So it's very powerful to note that. This school, as I mentioned, existed until 1858, so 5 years after the abolition of slavery in Cordoba. The school as a whole and exists still today. And actually, when I went there 2 years ago, I believe, when I took these photos, I could hear them playing in the background, in the larger space. And then I, of course, was regulated to the museum. And so we still see that the church is a very powerful institution today in Cordoba, and still continues to rescue, as I would argue, as I would argue, Lord, let me try this again. I'm sorry, I get nervous. So the church then still continues to rescue these children and ultimately continue to institute levels of Catholicism, and it's ultimately for those that are orphan kids and those that are impoverished. The other aspect too I want to stress about this amazing find that I have is the picture in the middle, which is of a Black and a white angel, two little girls, that was created at the end of the 19th century, and it's still part of the chapel today. So it's, again, a very interesting find, something that I actually found late. I didn't realize I was walking by it every single day. And finally something, I was giving a paper and someone had suggested, well, what about the school? And I said, what school? And so this ended up being then chapter 6. And I'm so happy I was able to include it in the book to kind of use that as a bridge to then move forward with what would ultimately take place, which is blancamiento. So looking at these women within the confines of the home, understanding the household, and of course, later education, really gave me a view of this transformation to whiteness, but also what it meant to escape Blackness. And of course, then understanding what is Indianness in the process, which is often left out of the conversation. And so, with that, what I ultimately want to conclude with is recognizing that these women oftentimes had to make a very difficult decision, but it was a decision that was based off of the choices that were given to them. And these women oftentimes chose their family first. And in doing so, they looked to any way possible, whether that meant to break the law or work in tandem with the law, to ultimately create and have a better life for their children. And in doing so, what we see is that they contributed to the creation of and the making of a white Argentina. So thank you.
All right, very good. So we have a general view of a historic and a social process, right, in Argentina that you pursue up to the end of the 19th century, or did you continue into the 20th century?
No, this for the book, I actually finished roughly about the early 1840s.
Oh, I see.
I wanted to make sure that we talked about the period prior to Blancamiento. So what is happening prior to, so the Republican period, not so much the national period.
I see. I see. Okay, I was just thinking that blanqueamiento, of course, you stopped before the publication, for instance, of Sarmiento's Conflicto y Armonía de las Razas, right? Which is a very important book and document of the way in which race was being conceived in Argentina in connection to the national project. Right? But you stopped before, right? Because this is a late work of Sarmiento. You almost didn't reach the point in which Facundo is published, right? 1845. This book is 40 years later, in 1883, I think. And at that point, the notion of skin color was a state concern, right? So blanqueamiento was a project of the state, right? It was kind of a prerequisite for, digamos, the efficiency of nationalism, if we want to put it that way, right? So I remember, I haven't read it in a long time, that for instance, if I don't remember incorrectly, in the Facundo, Sarmiento makes reference to Arabs, for instance, right? At some point. I don't think he ever mentions blacks, but in the notion of Arabs, is not so much the skin color, is the civilization that is being brought into the conversation of in Argentina as a nation, right? But in Conflicto y Armonía de las Razas, he's arguing that a prerequisite for the success of the national project is blanqueamiento, and that means an attempt to overcome Mediterranean races. That was dark enough for Sarmiento, right? Italians, we don't need that. Yeah, we don't need in Argentina more people from the south of Europe because they are not white. What we need is immigration from the northern countries Suecia and maybe Germany, countries like that. So his idea that blanqueamiento had to go, was going against Spain and against Italy, right? He didn't want, there was a big resistance to Italians, which are half of the basis of the population in Argentina as they are in Uruguay, because they thought that they were not white enough, right? So the idea of is not so black and white, is that the notion of whiteness is Northern European at that point, right? I don't know if you see a change in that when we go into the 20th century, or did you study the connection between the national project and the conception of race at the time?
So, like I said, I do the period prior to, but what I do find interesting, and my book does hint to it, is that some of the ideas of Sarmiento, especially when it comes to education, was actually already being put forth in Cordoba at the end of the 18th century. And this notion of modernizing the city was actually put forth by the governor intendant Sobremonte, and this need to ultimately look to Europe as a model to follow. So we are seeing these connections. That is correct. With civilization and Barbary, as you mentioned, this is in the 1840s. That is a moment, of course, in which he's looking at the interior as problematic, right? And so we're looking at BA as a potential European project. And as you mentioned, it was for Northern Europeans. What they received were Southern Europeans, which for Sarmiento was not the ideal. But still, it was interesting to see how that process came forward and still transformed completely the demography of what is Argentina today. Now, in the interior, we're not going to find that immigration is going to be as, I shouldn't say relevant, but as impactful at the beginning, right? It's going to be mainly Buenos Aires is going to receive them. It's going to take until the late 19th century, early 20th century for these immigrants largely to come to, or at least eventually move to Cordoba. And so it's a little more of it's a less of a whitening process in Cordoba than, let's say, in Buenos Aires. And I think today you could still see that stark contrast between the populations, those from the interior versus those that are porteños today. So those are the type of things that I remember about what the book ultimately allows for. It shows the beginning process, right? As you so eloquently discussed, this blanqueamiento, but the seeds of blanqueamiento, the movement to institutionalize it, begins in the Republican period with this question of what type of republic or country / nation do we want to be? And it's clearly by looking at these Black girls and these women, it was going to be one that was not going to have levels of Blackness. Blackness is equivalent to enslavement. So we're moving away from that and looking at least in terms of Cordoba, the institution of education, that was one of the ways to move these recently freed young population away from their Black past. So it's very interesting to see how this is already happening in Cordoba. Clearly, it continues in Buenos Aires. We have the Black press that also discusses how they're dealing with this onslaught, they would argue, of immigrants that were taking their jobs. So at times appearing very xenophobic. But yeah, it's very interesting to see how Sarmiento's ideas ultimately do come to fruition, although not exactly how he planned.
Okay, very good. I have other questions, but we will have opportunity to talk later. Any questions from the audience? Questions, comments? Anybody? No questions at all?
Yeah, Yamila is raising her hand.
Yamil? Yeah. Yamil?
You're muted.
Sorry, now I have sound. Thank you for your presentation. I am really happy with your talk, and I'm looking forward to read your book. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, how do you see the process of the meanings of this whitening when we consider that the white races in Latin America were not as white as, say, Anglo-Saxons or Germanic races? Do you think that this possibility of more, how do you say, of more convivence among different races, I think that is a particular trait of whiteness in Latin America, especially in Argentina? I don't know if my question is clear, but how do you think that the convivence of the Afro population, indigenous people, and white that were not as white because of this history of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, of the Iberian Peninsula? Uh, it was different. How different do you think it was to the experience of in the US, for instance?
Oh, that's a big,
Yeah, sorry.
Another book.
that's a huge question. Oh goodness. So I have to answer. I think and I can really just speak for Argentina at this point, but this construction of whiteness is so interesting to see how it played out over time. And what we're looking at is, in my case, the book is showing the beginnings of this blancamiento. But as you mentioned, for them, at least these intellectuals such as Sarmiento and Alberti, it was to look at Northern Europe as the exemplars of what is modernization and civilization. So when you have, for example, these Italians or these Spaniards, but they're saying, Spaniards, we just got rid of you a few years ago. Why are you coming back? Now, ultimately coming to Argentina, for some, it was a bit of a disappointment, I'm sure. But after one or two generations, they still are able then to extol levels of whiteness that those that are of indigenous descent or of Afro descent cannot obtain. And that is what is key. Now, when you make that comparison, of course, with the United States, that is why I think you see a lot of Latin Americans that when they come here are discovering, oh, I'm not white anymore, right? Oh, because I'm not Anglo white, even, so that's where I think you see that difference. But within the Latin American context, they are exemplars of whiteness. And so they do, in many ways, are able to have that level of privilege of whiteness that Afro descendants, and indigenous peoples do not have. But I do think you're hinting on, well, then when they come to the United States, then what happens? And that's when they discover, oh, but not here. So, and that's clearly beyond my topic, but that's something I do think is very important to explore. Again, is this creation of whiteness, and when it does and does not apply, ultimately whiteness is who has the privilege, right? Who has ultimately the power dynamics. That is what we're seeing. Good question.
Anybody else?
Ángela, adelante.
Gracias, Nacho. Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for your wonderful presentation. I have a question for you regarding the distribution of the city. For so many years in Colombia, the Black population can't reach specific places in Bogota. Still, it works that way. So I was wondering if they were allowed to live in specific places in Buenos Aires after they got married, or they had specific privileges, or where did they live as a allowed group? Because I'm absolutely sure that they had like the South. Bogota is usually the South, which is really racist, of course. But how Buenos Aires work in that way?
So I can't speak on Buenos Aires, but I can speak about Cordoba.
Okay, that will be,
Just
thank
to
you.
be clear.
Sorry.
So what we found over time is, if you think of the map that I showed, we did find those that were free, because those that were enslaved lived with their slaveholders. But those that were free lived in the southwest section of the city by the Cañada. So by, the Cañada, which ultimately flowed, it overflowed, right, and flooded on a regular basis. So a very impoverished part of the city. So I think that you definitely see those connections, right? Once they're free, where are they living? They're not living, and it was very clear, in the northern part of the city, right? Or within the plaza as a free person. They were not permitted to live there, but instead, where unfortunately it flooded on a regular basis, where you saw this lack of employment, oftentimes a very impoverished area, that's where where social historians have found it. And they did so by looking at the census data and replotting every single family. And they found that is ultimately where they were regulated.
Oh man, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I was wondering, Erika, if you have an approximate idea how many Blacks entered Argentina in the colonial period?
Yes, in general, the conservative, well, I shouldn't say conservative, the overall, the general estimate is that over about 60% of the population were castas, and of that, 30% were enslaved. But keep in mind, we're looking at small populations, very small populations. So, and it definitely grew with the interior. And so in my case in Cordoba, these numbers really reflected in a very tense, but in small elite population that was constantly fearful of them potentially taking over because they were such a small minority.
And they integrated into which kind of jobs, into which kind of servitude?
So ultimately it would be semi-skilled jobs, especially within the urban sphere. So you're looking at and of course gendered. So you have your blacksmiths and your artisans. They would ultimately be of castas, free, and of course the enslaved, and then the domestic sphere as well. So you're looking at your maids, your cooks, the sewers, seamstress, all of those who are also casta women, both free and enslaved.
Exactly. So it was the same in Uruguay. They integrated into domestic work basically, or
Exactly.
some semi-specialized manual labor. But of course, we cannot think of slaves in those countries as we think of slavery in Brazil,
Right.
or as we think of slavery in the Caribbean area where they are in the plantations or in mines or things like that. In the case of Argentina, it's kind of a different kind of servitude, right?
Yeah.
So that is a very important difference. For instance, when we teach this kind of, and we talk about slavery in Argentina, we need to be clear about the working conditions and the kind of jobs and the conditions of living. Everything changes really. It's much more attenuated, if you want to put it that way, right?
Yes, definitely. And also a reminder of the strength of the church, and particularly the Jesuits, that had these vast ranches,
Yeah,
and of course the University of Cordoba. And that is actually, the church owned the majority of the slaves in the Rio de la Plata,
yeah.
because of the Jesuits. So they're working also on ranches, ranch hands, of course, cowboys, as we would call them today, gauchos. They're doing
With
this.
cattle and with the farm and
Yes.
that kind of jobs. Yes,
Yes,
yes.
exactly.
So when we talk about slavery, is a qualitative difference from what we see in Brazil and countries like that. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. I always wonder because I know less about that, or I know not much about it. And it's one of the things that you're going to have to address in your article for us. The situation in Paraguay. I was
Yeah.
always curious about the situation of Blacks in Paraguay because it's not a topic that you usually see, as a topic for scholarship or anything like that. I haven't seen that.
Yes, and luckily a book just came out by Sean Austin that's dealing with it, so I'll be able
Okay.
to address it.
Oh,
Yeah.
good, good.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Other questions?
I have
Or-
Matt, I have Rex.
Huh?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to ask a question following up. I mean, yeah, I just thought this was really interesting, and I really enjoyed the talk. And I think the questions about different like labor regimes and how that ends up sort of impacting also the whitening process is really interesting. And I've been reading a lot about the coffee boom in southeastern Brazil, and it's just such a different scenario because the countryside becomes very, very white very quickly because the point was to import labor on the coffee plantations. But I guess I kind of wanted to just ask about, to go back to what you were talking about with the Jesuits, because that really interested me. I was interested in that because I work in the Amazon, and one of the things that we see is sort of a soft ending of sort of indigenous forms of slavery and servitude, and the ways that once African slavery is introduced, how there's sort of a weird negotiation between indigenous people and enslaved Africans in the Amazon under slavery, and then after abolition, that there's again sort of a because of the influence of the church, a sort of the Jesuits, despite the fact that they were saying oftentimes that they were the advocates on behalf of indigenous people against slavers, they end up sort of, before the Jesuits get kicked out, they're sort of also engaging in forms of labor appropriation. And I just wanted to ask about sort of the history of that in Cordoba, and how that sort of frames some of the things that you're thinking about. Sorry if that's sort of a vague general question, but
Well,
thank you so much.
no, it's a great question because oftentimes we do, that's again another reason why we need to continue to really investigate and interrogate Cordoba's history. Just as much as we do BA, because Cordoba, I mean, that was the epicenter, right, of the Jesuits in the Rio de la Plata. They get there at the end of the 16th century. They create the university by 1613. They create the Colegio shortly after. Both exist still today, so 400 plus years later. Then you have, of course, their ranches. There's about 5 of them, and one of them in Alta Gracia you can visit today to see how they even lived. And then, of course, they have a very strong presence in what is today Paraguay as well. So, I mean, the Jesuits in general create a very self-sufficient network of an economy, which clearly gets them in trouble later on. And one of the reasons why they get kicked out. But what I saw, especially in the Cordobese experience, is that they had enslaved and free and Indians working together, right? And at times they would try to create an antagonistic relationship. So the overseer for a particular ranch may be indigenous, overseeing, Afro-descended slaves, or vice versa, because they also wanted to create a tense relationship so that they could never come together, right? Because it's always the fear that the most marginalized will come and then eventually take over. So that's what I kept seeing constantly, especially when it came to the Jesuits in the Rio de la Plata. And there's a really great book by this guy named Jorge Torosi. No, I think his name, I know I'm saying his name wrong. He would kill me, but he wrote it, and it was ultimately called The Gold of the Jesuits. right? It's not the teachings, it's the slaves. That's how many they had. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's just exactly sort of this same sort of processes we're seeing in the Amazon, and yeah, it's just interesting. It reminds, there's a book about the Amazon called Red Gold that, yeah.
Okay, similarly.
Same
Yeah.
art.
Again, any more questions? Okay, then, Erika, we thank you very, very much for your presentation.
Thank
And,
you.
you know, we hope to have you maybe in another occasion for talking about your next book. Okay?
Definitely.